I think it's time to start. I think
All right.
if people join us, that's great, and if not, that's fine. We'll have some good conversation. So in a group this small, I think it's always appropriate to be informal. So feel free to open your mics, add your comments orally. If we had 50 people on the line, we'd be using the chat. But for a group this small, I think it's important to kind of try to meet your needs and flex to kind of the questions you're bringing, the thoughts that you have, the reflections that you have to offer. And we'll kind of be a little flexible. I mean, I've got an outline and all the rest. I did my homework, but we'll try to be responsive to where you're coming from and reflect the kinds of programming you're offering and the needs that you do. So, yeah, Sean.
Stephen, Sarah gave a good introduction for you, but the one thing that was missed was where you are. Are you in Toronto or where are you?
I am. My office is based out of Toronto. I'm the General Counsel Office of the United Church of Canada, and I think I'm the only judicatory official here today. So I don't work out of a seminary. I work out of the General Counsel Office as the judicatory of the denomination. And so the national office for the United Church of Canada is in Toronto. I also serve a church in Toronto. And so I wear two hats and kind of go back and forth between the two. And today I'm about 45 minutes north in my home in the town of Aurora.
Okay.
So I kind of backed into this work. I was doing some facilitated learning groups and that kind of stuff in the 2000s. And then they came to me at the denomination and said, we need you to, and I was doing it all on telephone conference call. And then they said, we've got this racial justice program and every minister in the country is supposed to do it. We've come to the end of the contract and there's still 500 ministers who's had to wash their hair every time it came up. And so they're not accredited. And could you do this by telephone conference? And I said, no. But I said, there's this brand new technology out and I've been just experimenting with it. Let me give it a go. And that was in 2011. So I've been doing these webinars now for 10 years, which is kind of neat. And we have grown this to offering, 60, 70 programs a year. Some of them are a series and we cover the waterfront from sort of very denominational centric things like how to become a minister and what's the process and the candidacy pathway to thinking about theological questions and personal and professional boundaries. And I was working with somebody earlier today on a program for Thursday, which is about preparing for retirement. So we do theological stuff, we do ministry stuff, a lot of just-in-time learning, all or almost all non-credentialed. We do have a licensed lay worship leader training program, which is a 2-year credentialing program. But that's the exception that proves the rule. Pretty much everything else I do is continuing education, usually very small fee, like $10 an hour, and just enough that people take it seriously, and a whole variety of different topics. And when I first got into continuing education, I thought that continuing education teachers had an easy job because there were all these great people out there who had things they wanted to teach, and all I had to do was create a schedule. And what I discovered is it ain't true. There are some interesting people who have things to say, but usually I have to go and hunt them down. And most of the people who have interesting things to say have no idea how to say it. And so over the last 10 years, but certainly over the last 7 or 8, I've been exploring ways to teach them how to teach and teach them how to use this medium to teach in, because I mean, you're working in institutions, so you'd be working with people who are used to teaching in classrooms. I'm working with people who are used to teaching in church basements, not always really well. But you put them into a webinar format and they're a fish out of water. And then the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, everybody wants to do a webinar because it's the only tool anybody can imagine. And so I thought the first thing to do really would be to put the brakes on some of those folks and say, when is it the right time to do a webinar, and when would a different teaching tool be better? So just for a couple of minutes, let's do some brainstorming together. Open your mics and we can just kind of talk, and I'll make some notes as we talk. When would you choose to sort of refer people to a book or a video? Or when would you choose to refer people to a, come on, resume share, to an asynchronous forum or a blog with comments? What are the best things about a live webinar, and when is it the right tool? If we can just kind of brainstorm together and fill out this chart a little bit, then we maybe get a better idea of when to say no as well as when to say yes. So let's start with books, articles, YouTube videos, kind of one-way pieces of communication. What are they best at and what are they not good at? I'll just make notes as you talk.
I think when the material is really dense, when there's when the material needs some real slow digesting and reflection in order to process.
Yeah, and this gives you a chance to go back to it, right?
Yeah, exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
I tend to think of those resources as content to support the learning, not the driving force for an engagement of a group of people.
It's very much individual learning, isn't it? It's not, It has nothing to do with groups at all.
Right.
I'm learning how to use a wood lathe. And every morning for breakfast, after my wife goes to work, I sit down with a YouTube video and watch somebody make a bowl on the lathe. I love it. But it's very much my own personal, I don't get any mentoring. Nobody tells me what to do or you know, what I'm doing wrong. On the other hand, I'm learning a heck of a lot and I'm really enjoying it. So that's a great thing about YouTube. What are some of the bad things about these things? When would you recommend against them? You will notice, by the way, that my teaching style is to be interactive, so you have to talk.
Now, to parallel to the first point that Sean pointed out, I think also that could be a con in the sense that if the material or the content to be discussed is too dense, and maybe you have to judge whether your audience would need some kind of background or explanation or kind of, you know, breaking down and then go and read. So I think you know.
Yeah.
That could go both ways.
For sure. Thank you.
I'm not sure how to say this succinctly, but there are some cases when I'm working with my people where they need interaction with with peers would be better in dealing with a particular issue than, say, you know, go to this website and read.
And
plus oh, sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Sort of to piggyback on that, what Debbie said, there's not an opportunity to ask a clarifying question without going to another, you know, non-responsive resource, so to speak. So, you know, and so from a theological standpoint, if many of us are from traditions that value, you know, the work of the Holy Spirit in discernment, and in understanding and coming to some sense of understanding, there's, you know, not that the Spirit won't work in the quiet and all that, I'm not saying that, but in terms of, you know, it's very one way and hard to clarify.
Yeah.
It also requires resources that have already been developed and created and are available. Sometimes what needs to be communicated. I'm thinking about early on in ministry when COVID first happened, and there weren't necessarily resources for people to draw upon.
Yeah.
And also there's some limited access, depends, you know, some books are not ebooks. You know, there's some articles you have to subscribe to the periodical. and those kinds of things. So in terms of accessibility, they're not always as easily accessible.
Yep.
And the whole idea too of broadband access and quality is
Sure.
can be an accessibility issue.
Yeah. So not to flog the horse, because we got lots to talk about together. I would usually recommend to my colleagues that they develop articles, handouts, YouTube videos, that kind of stuff, when there's specific data that they're trying to convey. If you want me to teach people what are the steps to becoming a minister, write it down in point form and give me a one-pager. Nobody wants to sit through an hour-and-a-half webinar with somebody just giving them data. Sort of blah, 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 blah. It sounds like the adults on Charlie Brown, right? So if we skip over the asynchronous forums and blogs, because I think they're kind of halfway in between, what are live webinars good at and what are they not good at? Because sometimes they're the wrong tool too. But what are live webinars good at that the others can't capture? Here, let me just leave that up so that you can see what you said before.
The opposite of what I said before, the interaction. I think the students I have in our program, when we send out the evaluations, the first thing they mention is great to get in a breakout room with people and just work through things and get resources.
Mm-hmm.
When there's ideas to be shared, which I guess goes along with interaction, but yeah, when the material is less maybe content rich and more, well, content rich is okay too, but certainly when you're talking about strategy and planning and ideas, you want the synergy that comes along with interaction and engagement.
Mm-hmm.
A con with a live webinar that is the same as in any that sometimes the dominant voices overpower without a good facilitator, and that is a pro for asynchronous forums.
Yes.
That it is more evenly accessed, allows people who are more reflective or who have learning disabilities and need more time to either auditorily, verbally, or in writing process the information.
Mm-hmm.
With some webinars, there's not really interaction with the attendees. Like they can interact with the presenters, the panelists, but they can't interact with the other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Scheduling is a con with live webinars. Unlike resources that are just available, participants need to be available at that time or watch the recording later, I guess, but then that moves it into a different category.
I tend to think of live webinars as an opportunity to hone judgment or to strategically solve problems.
I guess another way I'd put it is sort of to test application of the material.
Mm-hmm. So when I'm talking with potential leaders, and most of my potential leaders are other adjudicatory authorities, I'm trying to get a sense of whether they want their participants to be thinking on their feet, or whether they want them just to be passive receptors of information. If we're trying to explain policy and there's really no opportunity to interact with it beyond asking a clarifying question, that's not very interesting. And I often suggest, why don't you put together a series of FAQ videos or FAQ pages or something instead? I think what makes webinars really fun is when they're interactive, and when people are thinking on their feet and honing their judgment and wrestling with case studies and those kinds of things. And so when I'm coaching facilitators, I'm always looking for the opportunities to move from the top to the bottom. And say, if we're going to do a webinar, you've got to understand we've got 100 minds gathered together around a problem. Let's use every one of them. You know, there's no point in just I mean, if it's just one person talking with a PowerPoint, you might as well record that ahead of time. You'll get better production values. And oddly enough, I say the same thing about online worship these days. You know, we're planning, we've been doing variety of different online worship services through the national office. We're planning one for a couple of weeks from now. And I keep saying to them, why don't we just pre-record this? What difference does it make that we actually have people live, and how are you incorporating them? So I mean, we did a Good Friday service and we pre-recorded the whole thing. The production values were beautiful. But the worship that I do in my church every week has stumbles and falls and problems. And it has interactive prayers of the people where people are praying live. We might well have 50 or 60 or 70 people on the line worshiping. And when we say, what are you grateful for this week? I never know what they're going to write. But that's the way worship works. I know when I stand up there at the front of the church and say, what shall we pray for today? I don't know what they're going to say either. And there's something authentic and real about that. So I think that's the challenge to those of us who are coaching facilitators, is to say, okay, so we're in a live forum. This is not a pre-recorded thing. This is not a YouTube video. How are we engaging the minds that are here? And how are we taking them seriously? So that's the first kind of conversation I always have with facilitators is this the right tool? And it might not be. And I've often pushed them over to somebody else.
I appreciate what you said, Stephen, about other tools, other approaches, because when we do most of our online courses at the seminary before the pandemic were strictly asynchronous. Not that the leaders wouldn't use a short pre-recorded video of 3 to 7 minutes or something that they did, or not that they wouldn't use a YouTube clip from something to illustrate a point.
Yep.
But when we pivoted for some of our other courses, like our certificate in spiritual direction residencies and spiritual formation and other courses that had, like practice teaching. It's hard to practice teach online. But so the question we ask ourselves, is this is it the best way to do it? And if there's a live section, what is the pedagogical intent?
Yes.
What are you going to do in the time that you can't do in an asynchronous forum with good, robust prompts and questions for engagement?
Well, exactly. So once you've decided then that live webinar is the way to go, every webinar platform has some tools, and a lot of them are the same. So typically, for example, in a group that's larger than this, I would have people writing to the chat rather than throwing the mics open. I find in a small group like this, we've got 8 people online right now, throwing the mics open works really well and is working well for us today. If I get over 15, I tend to say, please type to the chat. And the advantage of that is that everybody can type at the same time. So nobody hogs the stage. Everybody's limited by how much they can type. So you don't get these long speeches. And I find it really empowers the introverts. We would typically do that. We've done that with webinars up to 1,000. That's a real challenge, to watch the chat. And when we do webinars over that size, then I'm often the one who's reading the chat, and I don't expect our subject matter experts to do that at all. And my job there is to kind of curate the chat and figure out what the questions are that are coming up, and what questions are coming up more than once. And so that as the presenter is answering a question, I'm gathering the next one. And I end up being more of an interviewer, watching the chat and interviewing. So that's a really powerful tool, and certainly in our governance meetings, as well as in our teaching opportunities, the chat means more people can interact if it's used skillfully. And so we get a larger variety of people. We get a larger number of voices participating and offering their comments. Another very common tool in all of these platforms is polling. There's a quick poll. So just for fun, fill out the poll and then we'll see what you say. How often are you, in your own role, expected or invited to comment on online pedagogy or coach facilitators on their technique? Do people look to you for that, or do they think that's maybe not your job?
And while we're responding to the poll, let's welcome Joshua to our group. He is one of our ALLLM leaders who wears multiple hats as a church leader, adjunct professor at 2 institutions, spouse, parent.
Soon to be 3, yeah.
Oh, soon to be 3, all right.
So most of you once in a while, which is interesting because in my job, it happens, I would say frequently, almost always, but not quite.
Stephen,
So,
how do you launch a poll? I've used them, like I've participated, as I just did, a number of times, but I've never launched them in a webinar that I'm leading.
Sure. And that, I would say that's the kind of thing where you need to learn your tool ahead of time and play around with it. Every webinar platform has a slightly different process. So I can show you how it works in Zoom, but if you end up using Adobe Connect or WebEx or Google Meet or something like that, my advice always is, when you're planning out a program, do it with yourself first. I'll set up with a laptop here and a laptop there. So the laptop on my right is the participant. And then I'll go and read the help menus and play around with it. And I'll do everything in my own sandbox with just me watching. And then I know what it looks like to me, and I know what it looks like to you. And when it comes time, I'm not fiddling around with stuff.
That's actually awesome. I never thought to come on as a participant on a separate device right beside me so that I can see. That's very helpful.
Makes a big difference. So,
and figuring out in the different platforms which you can set up. Can you set up polls ahead of time? Can you not? Do you have to load them the same day? So there are lots of foibles.
Yeah, so here's a second poll just for fun. When you're working with your facilitators, do you tell them to turn their webcams on never, sometimes, or always? Okay. So most of you say always. Why? Why do you make that recommendation?
Well, I think the always is so that you can see there's really live people there. It's part of the, it's part of the coming together, you know?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's part of it. I mean, you know, but I also think I put sometimes, because I also think there's times that people can turn their camera off depending on what's happening in their space. If they have shared space, like if they have children in their space. And so if they need to kind of be available, then it's not distracting to the other people. Or if it's being recorded and for some reason they don't want their space to be recorded.
Yeah, helpful comments. Anybody else want to add to that?
I think like an underlying goal that you're helping me to bring to the surface is the concept of hospitality, the concept of making a group out of the people on the screen before starting, or even as a process of going through the experience together. I was shocked when my spouse told me once, my computer engineer spouse said, "Oh, I've never used the video camera for all our meetings." And I thought, well, no wonder you hate your job. And I can't imagine not using it, right?
Yeah.
Well, as the presenter versus participant, it's sort of the same thing. Is what's the pedagogical intent for the presenters? If the presenter is using a PowerPoint to illustrate a bunch of stuff, let's focus on that. But if it's in an opening, closing, group building, facilitative discussion, in addition to what Stephen said, I think those are, or if there's technical issues that they have broadband or issues where they're freezing up, their audio comes through just fine, then let's not distract with a frozen presenter.
Yeah. I mean, this has been one of the big questions people argue about in webinars for the last several years. I think I'm hearing less arguments about it recently. I think we're getting more and more of a sense of how important human connection is. That's certainly one of the things we've learned in this pandemic, I think, is how much we're social creatures. And when Zoom has suddenly become the substitute for in-person meetings, we're treating it differently. I'm amazed at how little teaching I have to do about how Zoom works now, because everybody uses it and they use it to connect. But this one really has been the big bugaboo for people, and lots of people don't like looking at themselves. And so they will often turn the camera off, not because they think it's better teaching, but because they don't want to be distracted by the pimple on their nose.
There are tools within Zoom where you can hide your own view and other people can see you, but you can't.
Yeah, or you can just put a Post-it note over yourself if you want to.
Right. I was going to
But yeah, my general advice to people is be human, be relaxed, be authentic. Don't read a script. Just be yourself, and the humanity of you is as much of what carries the day as any information you share.
Yeah, I tell people about they can blur their background, or they can put virtual black backgrounds.
Which you've done.
I mean,
yeah.
which I did, just so you could see what that looks like.
Yep.
Or you can use a filter.
That's true, you can.
Just so long as you don't turn into a cat,
you can
right?
do lots of things. I like showed my pastors how to do that. They were impressed because they had never had time to think about that.
I did that when on a call with my grandchildren, and they were super impressed because they didn't know how I did it.
The great tool for online Sunday school, let me tell you.
Yeah, especially with you.
Yep. Oh, I've got the kids in my Sunday school teaching their teacher how to do this, and they're all under 10. But they're all doing online school these days, right?
Yeah. And they figured out how to do those things too.
So here's another way to build a poll, which allows you not just to have a poll, but to do some prioritizing after you've done some brainstorming. So let me start with this and my question, and I'd just like to brainstorm 10 answers, and then we'll prioritize and figure out what rises to the top. What do online teachers need most help with? Let's brainstorm first, don't edit, and then we'll prioritize after we're done.
So I can't see what's on your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I sharing the wrong thing?
No, it's just small.
It's just
It's just too small. Okay.
So if you could zoom on your
Let me see if I can.
Not zoom, but if you could make it larger
yeah.
on your screen.
I don't know whether it will let me do that or not.
I know.
There, try
like
that.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yep.
Perfect.
Okay.
And that's another example of being familiar with what you can and can't do for your
So,
audience.
what do online teachers need the most help with? Eventually, we're going to choose the top 3, but right now we're just brainstorming.
How to increase student engagement.
Sure.
I was thinking how to keep people interested. It's very similar to that one.
Yep.
How to be sure that the content relates to the goals of the event. In other words, don't waste time padding.
Right on. I love it. Okay.
Effectively using the features of whatever platform.
Thank you.
That's really helpful, Jessica. Thanks.
That's great.
Before they, as they're preparing for their presentation, thinking through whether how they're going to present it can transfer well online from.
Sorry, I just lost it. Let me come back
Oh,
here.
there it is.
Uh-oh.
It's okay. I
There it is.
clicked the wrong button and lost it. Say that because I was fiddling instead of listening.
As they're preparing for their presentation, have them think and encourage them to think through how it will or will not translate from the typical from on-site classroom to online learning.
Along those lines, working out timing and workload, like those things don't, it's not a one-for-one translation between in-person and online.
Right on. These are great. You guys really know what you're doing. I'm going check, check, check.
How to delegate a co-host to help watch the chat or the waiting room, or something. You know, many of us, I'm just thinking of my own church where I worship. We have, when we have in-person Sunday school, we often have what we call a shepherd to help the teacher get the power, you know. Well, this is the tech shepherd.
Yeah.
To think that they can do it all themselves.
Right on. Anything else coming to mind? It doesn't have to. We've got 8. That's pretty good.
Creating creative presentations using the spotlight feature on Zoom. Telling creative stories using Spotlight.
Okay. Anything else? Doesn't have to be. Okay, so let's stop sharing that. Let's pull that poll up into Zoom. Where is it? There it is. Choose 3. They should look familiar. What are the top 3 for you? So looks like you've all voted. So, oh, I don't want to relaunch it. I want to share it. So that's what you said. The top ones: how to increase student engagement, how to use the features of the platform, how a curriculum will translate. I think those are crucial. As we're trying to work with facilitators, those are really important things to focus on. If we can help, if we can coach our facilitators to do a good job on those 3 things, people will want to come back for more.
It's, you know, similar to when we're in face-to-face, we work with presenters to know your room, know where the outlets are, know where the windows are. How do you want to set up? This is a similar kind of thing.
Yep.
And we, most of us don't want people, as Debbie said, who are going to come in and talk a one-way lecture. Most of our learners expect dialogue.
Yeah.
Of some kind, and that's.
So here's my next question. We used 3 polls in 3 different ways over the last 20 minutes. What did you like about what we did? What did you notice? How are these different from each other as teaching tools?
Mm-hmm.
I liked doing the brainstorm together and using the polling feature that way.
Yeah.
I've been part of some webinars that have used the polling feature, but it seems like it was just to try to do something to keep us engaged, but it didn't actually matter to the content. So to make it matter and fit within the content is very helpful.
Yeah.
I did appreciate the poll on the expectations, sort of to know the experience in the room.
Mm-hmm. That first one really is just a very basic reporting.
Yep.
I mean, if I had asked you your favorite flavor of ice cream, it would have been even less relevant, but it certainly doesn't provoke a lot of discussion. It provokes some. The interesting one about that one was the conversation afterwards.
Yes.
Right. I've used that kind of poll in a webinar for professional boundaries about finances. And we would say, how often is it appropriate for the minister to be making financial decisions in the congregation? Or how often is it important for the minister to be involved in the investment strategy? And then you get it all over the map, and then you talk about why. And you can really talk about what's the minister's role and what's involved in making investment strategies, and why is this a theological issue and not just a financial issue. And so you can use that as a jumping off point for a really useful discussion if you get people involved in the whys. And this prioritizing one, and I cut off the top of it because I didn't know what you were going to come up with. But that's a really valuable tool. And I've done that a lot in governance meetings and things too, as we're trying to figure out what's our way forward. But when we're trying to talk about how to hone judgment, how to think on our feet, how to do some strategic planning, those kinds of things, I think all of those are valuable ways to use the polls. But if they're just about tell me who you are, they're boring, as Jessica said. They're not really engaging unless we use them in engaging ways. So I would say coaching facilitators, the challenge is to go beyond playing with the toy, to figure out how to make the toy serve the pedagogical purpose that we're trying to teach. Thoughts, comments, ideas around that?
That was very helpful to actually engage in the 3 different types before we knew what we were doing and why we were doing it. I mean, you knew what you were doing, Stephen, but we didn't realize we were being introduced to them,
Sure.
that they were going to be different until afterwards, sitting back and going, yes, they were very different in terms of the kinds of responses they invoked in us as well. So
almost inevitably, when a facilitator proposes we use the polls, they use the first one.
Yeah.
And they will justify it by saying, oh, we're building community, which is a very 1970s way of kind of opening your program, right? It's sort of faith in the common good stuff that came out of the 1970s. And I think
for those who were born then.
Yeah. But yeah, I think this is a powerful tool if we can help people to use it well. So, and it's one of the few tools that are kind of built into every webinar platform. So I challenge you when you're working with a facilitator who wants to do engagement to try to go deeper than Jessica's remark. Oh yeah, they just use it because they want us to push buttons. Keeps us awake.
Well, and another question to ask is a poll the best or the only way to raise the question? Could using images on the screen, like that, you could have shown a picture of a presenter, with a, crossed out, yes, no, all, and so that, sort of sometimes to mix things up because people get word weary.
Yeah.
And the use of images can be helpful too.
Yep. And I think one of the things that keeps pulling people back in is variety. So if we can use polls, and then we use a video clip, and then we use imagery, and then we use a case study, and we can do all of those different kinds of modalities within the same hour-and-a-half curriculum, it's going to be much more engaging. It's a lot more work than writing a script and reading it. But it's much more fun for the students, and I think, frankly, for the teachers too, if they can get there. Most teachers go into this stuff because they have stuff they're passionate about that they want to share. And usually I think what gets them tongue-tied is anxiety rather than the fact that they don't have something they want to talk about. So giving them a chance to play with the different modalities and respond in different ways, I think can be really fun.
Also, I just was thinking of an example that happened to one of our instructors, super knowledgeable scripture teacher, scholar, retired from her job, and now she teaches continuing ed, for the community. And these groups were set up in parishes where it was in person, and people had snacks and coffee, and she's super knowledgeable, and everybody was like listening all the time. And then they would go to small groups and come up with gazillion questions, and super engaging. When we all had to go online last year, people started getting bored and kind of complaining. And, the director of the scripture school and myself, we started trying to bring opportunities for them to learn different things. And so it was, amazing for me how the different medium would provoke this. And it was like, she had the same students, they just all went online.
Yes.
So it's crazy that way.
I've got a couple of theories about it. I agree with you completely. And often people who are riveting in person are not on the screen. Part of it is that the screen is so small. It's this tiny little box. And so there's all the rest of the distractions around us. And the screen comes with its own distractions, right? I mean, we can watch this and we can check Facebook at the same time. So we're fighting that. But also, I think we're conditioned to look at screens differently. How often do you watch a television program where you see the same person talking for an hour? Like, pretty much never. Pretty much never. Even on the news programs that we watch, they often have two anchors, and then they'll shift over to the reporter in the field, and then the reporter will interview somebody. And then you come back and the reporter will go interview somebody else, and then they'll come back again. So that there's always this shift of focus, different voices, different faces, different accents, different ways of sort of pulling our attention back to the screen. And that's something that a lot of my presenters really have a hard time with, because usually they're used to writing an essay and then reading it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Mariana. One of the things I've often found helps with somebody like that is to interview them.
Good idea.
And then if we can, I'll sit down with them and I'll brainstorm 5 or 6 questions and say, what can we do about this and that and the other thing? We'll get an outline of questions. And then in between, I'll watch the chat. I'll bring in questions from the chat. And my job is to be the interviewer, but it gives 2 voices instead of 1, and that can really help. I did a book launch a couple of weeks ago where I interviewed the author, but we also did 30-second tributes from some of the people who had written reviews of the book ahead of time. So I would intersperse these. We'd have a question and an answer from the person. And, oh, Ross, before we go any further, I've got this comment from Catherine McLean in Edmonton. And I would play the video clip. And he hadn't seen the video clips ahead of time. So you could watch him reacting to the wonderful laudatory things that you say at a book launch, right? And that variety of going back and forth between the video clip and my interviewing and the questions from the audience meant that at the end of the hour, people didn't want to leave. That was kind of fun. And Ross is an academic. He was writing a book about preaching. And I don't know what kind of preacher he is, but he's not riveting. He's academic, thoughtful, provocative, but his voice doesn't go up very much in volume. And the interviewing was the way to make it work.
That's an example of us knowing our audience, meaning our audience as presenters, or developing a relationship with them at first to sort of assess.
Sure.
Yeah.
So one of the big things that people love about Zoom is the ability to go into breakout rooms. That is really exciting to an awful lot of the presenters I work with. And what I'm finding is they have no idea what to do with the people once they're in breakout rooms. They just know that it's a great idea and a wonderful tool and people like it. You're laughing at me. You're not having that problem?
I've been in that
problem. No, we're laughing with you.
What I've found is that the people I work with have very little training in pedagogy. And they really don't know how to frame questions in ways that are going to lead to better learning. They're not even sure what they want people to learn out of the case study, quite apart from how to provoke discussion. So often what we get, instead of using a case study as a chance to wrestle with a controversial issue, we get people who just sort of say, so what happened in this case study? That's boring. I just thought for fun together, and maybe because you guys are so much more comfortable with this than some of the people I work with. There's a case study that I use in a boundaries course. This is our introduction to boundaries course. And I'll just read it. Robin's spouse died of cancer a couple of years ago, and members of the congregation were warm and supportive as Robin took a bit of time off and then came back to work as minister in the church. Robin was surprised at how hard it was to get back into the routine of ministry, and a few of the parishioners could see that Robin was struggling and were very willing to hear stories of that grief. One relationship in particular began to develop in ways that Robin hadn't expected. In spite of the continuing grief, Robin started to feel some personal attraction for Chris, began to wonder if it might be time to begin a new relationship. Chris was warm and understanding, and Robin always felt respected and cared for when they were together. Chris seemed to feel the same way. Robin's parents had met on their first mission field. Robin knew it was common in previous generations for ministers to find a spouse or a new one among their parishioners. And Robin was beginning to wonder whether it would be okay now to pursue a relationship too. So there's a case study we use probably 5 times a year in our Introduction to Boundaries course. And the question here, I guess, first of all, the question is, what did you notice in that? And if you were going to give this to a group for a 10-minute small group breakout discussion on Zoom, what do you notice? What jumps out at you in that? Is it a useful thing?
For me, who is more of a auditory learner, there were just too many words. Okay. For having you read it, though, was very helpful. I think actually even having doing it in first person, I think would have been more engaging and maybe cause the details to sink in better.
Thank you.
Or having multiple voices read it. I also noticed that these were gender neutral name.
Yep, that's very United Church of Canada.
Well, but it's also sort of hospitality, and it makes room for who is in the room.
Yep.
Without making a big statement about it, and it doesn't take a heck of a lot of effort.
Yeah. Thank you. Sean, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when you go into breakout rooms, it'd be important, I think, for you to have some questions for them to wrestle with out of this. but also to be able to continue to have this script, so to speak, available to them.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're going to do a breakout meeting and now you've lost what was there formerly, and you're not able to go back to check things. So somehow to continue to make that available to people as they go into their breakout rooms would be valuable.
One of the really irritating things about Zoom is that once they go into breakout rooms, they can't see the PowerPoint anymore.
Right. So
What
is there some way to...
There is. What I've discovered
Okay.
is that the chat persists. If you go into your breakout
Yes.
room and you open your chat, it's the same chat for the whole meeting.
Okay.
And so I would cut and paste this into the chat, and I tell people, when you get into your breakout room, open the chat and it'll be there waiting for you.
Wonderful.
And then they have the text, and that helps mitigate against the too many words thing, Debbie. I agree with you. This one's too long. The biggest problem we have, though, is questions. Now, how to help your facilitators frame questions that are going to be useful and not boring or redundant. So just for fun, because it's always easier to poke holes and figure out what's wrong rather than what's right. Here are 3 that I rejected. Any thoughts about why I would reject those as a useful discussion topic in a program on boundaries?
Well, I don't think those are the first things they should be thinking about. I think that first there's a bunch of other stuff about boundaries that should come up first, I think.
Yeah.
They're yes or no questions.
Yes.
Closed.
So they're very closed, aren't they?
And they're also tangential to some degree. Should Robin have gone back to work so soon is entirely tangential to the issue of boundaries.
Can't change it now. Robin's back at work. Yeah. Can't change the past. So why would we harp on it?
Well, and they're judgmental.
Aren't they?
Yeah.
And they don't look at the sort of the facts.
So this is a great example of how people know that it's important to use a case study, but they don't know how to use it. When I started thinking about this, and I did a webinar a few years ago called Beyond the Talking Head, where I started really researching, I did it for ALLLM. I started researching adult learning techniques and active learning techniques, and came up with this tool that I now use every time with my facilitators, and sort of invite people to think about asking, I always ask the reaction questions. What did you notice? Same night, I read the case study and I said, what jumps out at you? Because people always react before they start to think. So I always start by saying, what did you notice? What surprised you? What jumped out at you? What did some kind of reaction question? As I said to the person I was working with earlier today, if you don't ask that question, they'll say it anyway. So if you can get it out, then you can get on and get them thinking. But then beyond that, I invite the facilitators to imagine a discussion question, often no more than one, that will help people do one of those 4 things: either analyze or synthesize or evaluate or apply. And I tend to cycle through those so that early on in a webinar, I might be asking analysis questions. What's going on here? Let's take this apart. And then as we're getting deeper into it, okay, based on what's going on here and what we've just been talking about, what would the next steps be? Can we create something new? Or sometimes evaluating pros and cons. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? Or finally, can we make some best practices? Can we together figure out how we might apply this in the parish? Now, maybe in the boundaries one, you're talking about guidelines for ministers, but maybe in the one on finances, you're talking about when would a minister be part of a financial discussion. What are your social media best practices? So I mean, my guiding principle is that one way or another, you want people to think rather than just react. Because the more they wrestle with something, the more they'll be able to take away. And framing different kinds of thinking questions is one of the hardest parts of creating a curriculum, I think, but it's what's going to make it most useful. So just for fun, listen to me. I'm probably the only person in the world who thinks this is fun. But I thought it might be interesting to sort of say, okay, having seen that case study, are you seeing the worksheet? Yes, you are. What are some analysis questions we might ask about a case study like this, where we're kind of exploring whether or not it's appropriate to go into a new relationship? Just because those are categories, but if we can kind of wrestle with how we would work with the tool, it might help to make the tool a little more understandable. One of the questions I might ask are, what are the boundary issues in this case study?
I was just getting ready to say that.
Yeah. That's an analysis question, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're not saying what's the right answer. We're saying what's going on. Let's take this apart.
Right.
Who has the power? Is there anyone else beside the people mentioned?
Are there denominational guidelines or expectations to be aware of?
Sure.
Or what, yeah. Not are they, what are, to make it an open-ended, because
Okay.
what are. That's sort of a similar way of asking the first question, but depending on your audience.
Sure. Right. I've moved your pictures over here, so when I look away, I'm actually looking at you. I've got 3 screens going and I can never find the camera. So if we were using analysis questions like that, you'd get into a very different kind of conversation than if we were talking about what are your best practices. Another one that I thought about when I was pulling this together is, what's the impact of the boundary issue on the pastoral relationship? Right? Like everybody else in the congregation. I don't know whether that's a word you guys use in your denomination. We do in ours. The pastoral relationship is the relationship between the minister and all of the people in the congregation. Mm-hmm. So if Robin and Chris start dating, what does that do to Robin's relationship with Fred and Susie and Susie's son? So I would say those are kind of analysis questions. What would we put into the second category? This is not easy, right?
No.
This is really tough. And this is where I really work hard with facilitators, because this is where the real creativity comes from. But I find having the tool means that I think of a broader range of questions before I choose the ones I want to encourage people to think about.
Yeah, I can see that.
A couple of the ones that I thought about when I was preparing for today. What are Robin's options now? Or who could be helpful to Robin?
Another one, maybe, how might you summarize the key issues as you understand them?
Mhm.
Could synthesis also include situations where you might compare people or people lean into their own life experiences and own stories and say, oh, I was in a situation that was like this and this is how we handled it, but we handled it badly over here, but then pretty well over here.
Mhm. Sure.
And then you can have that conversation where you're kind of connecting. Would that be considered a synthesis?
I think it could be combining ideas to form a new whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that sort
Right.
of integrates between synthesis, evaluation, and application. But if it's a question that leads you, if that's where you want to go,
Yeah.
you want to ask the question somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking in terms of making the connections between your story and then this particular situation. Yeah,
Yeah.
it can fit in a couple of different.
Make connections. Yep. Little dangerous in one on personal boundaries and intimacy, I think. You don't know what people might disclose and whether that would knock everybody off the rails. But
yeah, maybe in a different example, but yeah.
Sure, I agree. But I think that's a good example of synthesis, and that might also be a reason why you wouldn't choose a synthetic question with this case study. But I use it because there are times when I might want each of these. So let's.
Well, I wondered even what other supports outside the church should there been for Robin in the first place. Like, she lost her spouse. She's a pastor. Like, what other supports does she have that's beyond the church, or what's available to her outside of that, outside of her job?
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, and then even another, have you seen other congregations behave this way in a caretaking manner to, a leader? Because, that could, because, sometimes there's systemic issues at play here.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I wouldn't want to ask, have you seen, because that's taking us out of the case study and asking us to report on something different.
Okay.
So instead we would want to be asking about when congregations want to take care of the minister, what are the pros and cons of that?
Yeah.
And that might push us down into the evaluation section rather than into the synthesis question.
Right.
But that would at least be open-ended enough to say that there are pros and cons.
Right. I wonder if this is a congregational pattern of caretaking.
Sure. Sure. But as we're trying to teach boundaries, then what will people learn about boundaries? So there's so much involved, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to carry on and finish filling out the chart because we're running out of time. But some of the things I thought about as I was pulling this together into the evaluation section. What's the danger if Robin and Chris pursue a romantic relationship? Who could get hurt? And what safeguards would make this okay?
Yeah.
Or in terms of the application questions, I was thinking about develop a list of best practices and resources. And what would make it hard to follow them? How would you address the blockages? So depending on how you want to use the case study and what you think people need to learn from it, will push you in the direction of different sorts of questions. And all told, I think people will learn far more if they're asking at least one of those kinds of questions in a case study. Because the more we force the brain to work, the more we take away at the other end. And then the challenge to us as people who design curriculum is, what do we want the brain to work on? Having decided it's a good idea, how do we choose the question that's going to help move the program forward and help the students learn the kinds of things we're trying to teach them?
I just appreciated even just demonstrating using that as a tool that I could use, for instance, when meeting with a presenter, not just during a pandemic, but another time, you know.
Right on. And I use those questions, those same categories, whether I'm working with people on a case study for a small group in Zoom, which is everybody's favorite hot to trot tool, or whether we're just responding to a video clip, or whether the presenter is going to give us a 10-minute mini lecture, or whatever it is. At the end of every new bit of input, I want the students to engage somehow.
Mm.
And I just found those categories help me make sure that they're engaging in different ways at different points, and that I'm not leaving out or missing or forgetting something important.
Stephen, that was, for me, that was a rich exercise, just thinking that through, or watching others think it through, because I was real slow at the switch. Is that, could you share that with us, that document with the questions? Just helps
sure.
me frame what the 4 different types are. That'd be helpful.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
No problem.
Because I think you're right. I think those are far more valuable types of questions than obviously the original 3 that you put up. Just leads to an entirely different level of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I appreciate you asking that question too, Sean, because one of the features in Zoom that works and doesn't work depending on the format is sometimes you can have a file, a Word file or a PDF, and attach it in the chat, and people can then download it for themselves like a handout, you know, like for a case study.
Yep.
But I have been in medium, large, and small groups where the facilitator has done that, and depending on the person's device and platform, they can't always access it. So
Right.
I have found it to be a less reliable than if I think people are going to want to refer to it, I may send it out as an email attachment ahead of time if it's not posted on a course site. But that's also something that I have tried to use with mixed success myself.
Yeah. Well, and that's an important comment. We need to distinguish between the script or your own speaking notes and the handouts and the PowerPoint.
Mm.
Each of them have a value, and I've got all 3 going here. Happy to share with you my outline, happy to share with you my PowerPoint, but probably afterwards, so that it doesn't distract from the conversation that we're having now. And I tend to put those in PDF format on the website with the recording. What I found is that a lot of people in my audience don't even have Word. So if I put up a docx thing or a PPTX, people can't read it. And so I make black and white copies of the PowerPoints so they can print them and read them on a black and white printer. And I make PDF copies of and I put those in PDF, and I make PDF copies of my notes or handouts as well. And resources, I never put links on a PowerPoint because I don't want people clicking on them during the event. I tell them, I'll send these out later. You can get this at the recording site.
It's good.
I don't want to give them an excuse to leave the webinar. If I put a link on the page, they'll go and find it instead of listening to me.
Yeah, and the only exception I would think to that is if you wanted them to refer to the link like in a breakout.
Yep.
You know, I'm giving you this link, pull it up. You're going to need it in the next 5 minutes.
Right on. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I just wanted to zip through a few tech tips, because this is part of the game, right? And these are probably things that you're already familiar with, but here's the first one, and it's the one that I was commenting on earlier to Sean. And that was, when I'm using a new tool, I always play into my sandbox by myself. I always set up a private meeting between my desktop and my laptop, and experiment with it and make sure I know what it looks like. And it just saves a whole lot of fiddle faddle around. And then if somebody says the type is too small, I can't see it, then I know how to enlarge it. But it makes a huge difference to me to just look competent. And the only way I can look competent is by playing around with nobody watching. I always make a timed agenda. I make a timed agenda and I budget the time for every section of the webinar so that I don't cheat the last section. And I'm amazed at the number of people who don't do that. So here's my, we'll put it in web layout. Here's my timed agenda for today's program. So I've got the times down here and they're all fairly carefully worked out so that I'm budgeting time. And you can see introductions, educational schools, using tools as a polls, a discussion starter, evaluate the polls I just used, using case studies for small groups. I mean, does this look familiar? I hope so. But all the way down, I've budgeted the amount of time, and that's the page I'll happily share with you, Sean, at the end, with the analysis and the questions that I was cutting and pasting and that kind of stuff. It's all there.
Super, I see it. Yep.
But I always budget the time so that I don't run out. And you can see I'm running over. I thought I'd be finished at 10 minutes past the hour, and it was 18 minutes past the hour by the time I got to this section.
We talked too much.
Yeah. So I lost 8 minutes somewhere. That's not too bad over an hour and a half. But I think having the timed agenda has made a huge difference to me in terms of keeping me on track and making sure that I don't lose the last section of what I've planned to do. Plan a rehearsal, especially when I've got multiple presenters. I mean, we're doing a lot of governance meetings in the United Church now. So the moderator and the general council executive, or we've done the whole general council several times. And all of our big regional meetings and so on, 150, 200, 350 people online. I'm amazed at the number of people who balk at the idea that we should have a rehearsal. And I just say to them, you got to do it. You have to get everybody together using exactly the same equipment that they plan to use on the day so that we can adjust things like lighting and backgrounds and audio and all of that kind of stuff. And so that we can walk through the agenda, everybody knows what their role is and what they're going to do next and when they come and how it's going to look. And people will whine and complain and tell me, oh no, we don't need it. Why do we have to do this? A waste of time. We get to the end of the rehearsal and they'll say to me, oh, I feel so much better. I was so anxious.
Yeah.
So yeah, I insist now, whenever I got more than just one or two people, and even if it's just a presenter I've never worked with before, even if it's just one, get together a rehearsal and walk through the agenda, make sure everybody knows what they're doing. And that's often the time when I can make a few suggestions about making it more interactive. And so that can help. Lighting and backgrounds are crucial. Particularly when you have people of color. It's unfortunate, but true that the darker your skin is, the more you're likely to be in shadow and the harder you have to work at a background that isn't too bright behind you and light on your face. And people who look like me have to be cautious about how they describe the need for that. But we don't serve people if we let them appear in shadow. So it's not a discrimination thing, but it is a reality that we have to be able to see the faces. So in my room here, I've got a light in front of me. I've got a darker background. I've actually got my grow lights beside me because I'm growing bedding plants for my garden as well. But I've worked hard to get enough light on my face that you can see me.
You can also buy just off of Amazon those little ring lights for, 25 bucks, and they attach to the laptop or wherever you want. You just plug it right into the laptop with the USB. It's great.
Yeah. So whatever the solution is,
Sure.
I think it's our job as the coach to make sure that our people are visible and audible. It's amazing the number of times they're using a a really bad microphone and you get echoes, or they sound like they're at the bottom of a well. And you can buy a pretty good headset for $40 these days. It doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. So I have a very expensive microphone here that I got as a Christmas present. I love it. And if I get right up close, I can sound like an FM announcer. But you don't need to spend $100 or $200 on a microphone. You really can. I've got a USB headset that cost me $40, and it's clear. And that's really all people need. So something we have to think about. Something we have to think about as presenter is bandwidth of our audience. And that's a particular issue in Canada because there's still large parts of rural Canada that don't have great bandwidth. And so if we're using the latest toys like a Prezi presentation or heavy duty video clips or something like that, it may not get through to our audience. And I'm not convinced that the latest glitzy toys are the best teaching mechanism. I think sometimes we spend too much time worrying about glitz and not enough about content. And what people really came for the content. If we can put our energy into shaping those discussion questions and finding ways to keep engaging people on the chat all the time, every minute, every 2 minutes, ask another question, invite another comment so that they don't leave you. It won't matter that you don't have Prezi. I've got people in my congregation who come to worship. I do a nightly worship every 6 o'clock every night. And I've got a couple of little old ladies who only join by telephone every night. So I have to do worship on Zoom that is rich enough that the people who come by Zoom get real worship, and it's visual and it's valuable. And it also includes Merlin and Martha.
Good.
And then there's questions of accessibility. What are we doing to include people who can't hear very well? What are we doing to include people who can't see very well? How do we work with these tools? And there is no teaching platform that works perfectly for everybody. There are classrooms that are inaccessible to people who have hearing problems or visual problems too. And so sometimes, and it's easier when we're not in the pandemic, I'll say to people, well, this is only one way you can get the course that you need. If webinars don't work for you, go and do it at the conference office. Can't do that right now. You know, I mean, everybody in the United Church, every minister in the United Church has to do racial justice training and boundary training. And for the folks who don't have a computer, that's really tough when we only offer it in webinar format. So finding ways to explore accessibility options is really important. Something we're still doing, but you know, important questions to ask. And finally, questions of copyright. If you're going to post your recording at YouTube, you need to be aware that YouTube has robots that listen for music. And that can be a particular issue if you're using videos, because YouTube may well flag your content and say it's copyright. And if you don't have the license, you have to take your recording down. Ran into that a couple of months ago with the webinar that Lakeisha Lockhart did for us. She had a piece of music that she played on a boombox behind her while we were supposed to be doing something creative. I didn't know it was coming. And YouTube flagged it as a copyright piece of music. Where's the license? I didn't have it. So something to be aware of.
Yep.
So the last little bit I just kind of rattled through because we really were running short on time, but those are the tech tips that came to mind for me off the top of my head. Any thoughts on those or questions or comments?
The one other thing on there, Stephen, that's missing, I think, is the importance of perspective. So if you're the presenter, put the camera at eye level. You know, don't be, you know, so many people hold their phone on their lap or something, and you're looking up the person's nose or whatever. But to keep the camera at eye level is really important.
Yes. Let me show you the integrated camera in my
Yeah, exactly. There you
laptop.
go.
Isn't that awful?
That's not how you want to present. Yep.
I call this my nose cam.
Well, and that's depending on what I'm doing, there are rooms and lighting or chairs that I'll use to accommodate those kinds of things, but the other thing that in a context we may need to be aware of is translation services. And in that case, sometimes we will need to get a script so that a translator can translate at least the PowerPoint and the key points.
Yep.
And Zoom does have a function where that can be used, and then coaching people on how to turn it off if they don't need to see the subtitles in translation.
The Zoom translation module for live translation works really well. I've used it several times for national events because Canada's bilingual.
Right.
And the simultaneous translators who work with us are about $650 for a half day. So it's not cheap, but it can be a godsend. So we use it for big governance meetings. We have used it for national worship services, that kind of stuff. And it's a very useful thing. It's like being at the United Nations where, you're listening in English, and if somebody starts speaking in French, then the translator will click the button and you start hearing English from the translator instead of French from the presenter if you're listening on the English audio channel. Works really well.
And that's just in webinar format, right?
No, it works in a meeting format.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. I don't use the Zoom webinar module, almost never. It's really set up more for kind of one-way broadcast. So if I want to do a one-way broadcast, I'll live stream to YouTube. It's free. And I'll use Zoom as the green room or as the studio. And then just live stream the Zoom meeting over to YouTube and do all the comments on the YouTube chat. And then you have an unlimited number of participants, whereas the Zoom webinar feature, I want it more interactive than that. When the pandemic hit, we started doing webinars for our church treasurers. We would have 1,000 people on the line. But the big value for them was that they could use the chat and talk to each other as well as to us. And then the challenge to me was to wade through the chat and pull out the questions for the presenters, as opposed to people who are helping each other and really don't need airtime. We've hit the bottom of the hour. So that's what I prepared for today. Any other last minute questions, thoughts, comments?
Just a word of thanks.
Okay.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was fun. Good to be with you.
Well, I would like, let's thanks our presenter for his demonstration of good facilitation and presenting and leadership skills. And it's a pleasure to continue to work with you, Stephen. And thank you to some of our newer visitors. Sean, I think you've been on a couple. Viva, you've been around for the past year, but Jessica and Debbie, you've come and gone. And so, we hope to see you again.
Yeah, I just joined like last month, I think.
Right, I think so.
Excellent.
So we hope you find this a community that is, we don't have all the answers, but we've got a membership of innovative people and are happy to put people in touch with each other, which is what good networks do.
Yeah, it's great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right.
Well.
And so we watch your email for announcements. We hope to have another couple of webinars between now and June or July. We probably will do a workshop of some kind as part of the REA annual conference, which will be all online. And we have an annual meeting coming up in November. We'll have some fall webinars. We will take a break in August for sure. So